All right. I see folks joining. Thank you everyone for coming to join us this morning or afternoon, whichever time zone you are in. I would love, as we're going to give another minute or two for additional folks to join. And so in the meantime, I'd like to chat in the chat. What are you looking for getting out of today? We've got great experts with us, and we want to be able to make sure that we're talking about things that are going to be helpful to you. This is about you learning. So let us know in the chat, what did you learn today? What piqued your interest? What has attracted you to come and spend an hour of your precious time on a Thursday learning about leadership development? Erin, what are you looking forward to learning from Greg? Greg, what are you looking forward to learning from Erin?
Oh, so much.
Yeah, no, okay. I mean, I think I am so excited to hear. I mean, Erin's depth in specifically in leadership development. This is, as you and I have talked about, this is such an important and increasingly important area. And there aren't too many folks who have the depth of background that Erin has and the practical experience as well. So I'm looking for the mix, the academic thought leadership that she has, but also the mix of what she sees working, what maybe could work better.
I love that, Greg. I can definitely provide some insight on that. For you, I'm looking forward to learning more about social capital from you, specifically with regard to the direction that you see it and the innovation behind what you're doing. So I want you to flip my mindset on a couple of things today. That's my goal.
And maybe for the audience who didn't get a chance to get a little bit of our pre-conversation, Erin has lived in amazing places around the world and probably has one of the most attuned sense of connections and culture and lived in fascinating different cultures. So my guess is he also has a unique perspective on that and working cross-culturally and building those connections, having lived around the world. Absolutely. I'm guessing that. Is that true, Erin?
I would say that's pretty true. I was actually just talking to someone this morning about that, and kind of how when you grow up with that level of diversity, how it really changes your perspective in adulthood and how you approach things really differently, specifically with regard to business, right? I really look inward and have an introspective journey, or recommend an introspective journey first and foremost for anyone looking to develop.
Oh, that's super cool.
All right. With that, I am going to kick us off. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar. We're so glad that you could make the time with us today. I'm Kirsten Moorfield. I am the co-founder and chief strategy officer here at Cloverleaf, and I am the host for today's conversation. I just want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A. Somebody already did ask a question about that jazz music. Yes, we did have that soothing jazz to kick us off today. We encourage you to submit questions through that. I will keep it open. I'll try to monitor that as we go, but we'll also have time at the very end if your question doesn't fit into to the time where I'm asking questions. We'll cover that in the last 10-15 minutes. And then also, if you want to step away or you have something else pop up, we are recording this session. We will send it to you with additional resources after our time here together. So to get us started on the topic, at Cloverleaf, we believe that great teams do not just happen, they're built with intentional development, meaningful conversations, and the right insights at the right time. So we've built a platform that helps individuals and teams understand strengths, communication styles, and just generally how to work better together every day. So for today's topic, we thought it would be very fitting to talk about leadership development. We've titled this Beyond the C-Suite, Making Leadership Development Work for Every Manager, because we are excited to explore real practical ways to scale leadership development so that every manager is getting the support that they need without overloading talent and learning and HR departments. So let me introduce the experts that we have with us today. Greg Pryor is the founding member at Connected Commons. Greg brings decades of experience in talent leadership from many great companies such as Accenture, Merrill Lynch, Workday, the Guild. Greg brings a wealth of insights on how organizations can unlock the full potential of their people, and we are very happy to have you with us today, Greg. Thank you. And Erin Myers is the Director of Leadership and Organizational Development at Galen College of Nursing. She literally has a PhD in leadership. She has spent years teaching it in academia and applying through consulting, helping organizations develop leaders who make an impact from day one. Thank you very much for joining us, Erin.
Thank you.
And Erin, I'll actually start the first question to you. So with your doctorate in leadership, your consulting, you have gained a broad understanding of what's happening and what is and isn't working. So what are the top 2 to 3 things you see working well in leadership development? And what are the pitfalls that you see as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I see happening a lot in leadership development right now is that there's a focus on it. There are a lot of companies that are recognizing that this is something that's needed, it's wanted for their employee value proposition. And that's a very positive thing. Kind of the pitfall that's associated with that is that people are using it as kind of a check the box. They're grabbing off the shelf training or asking their training and development team to create leadership development. And that's not, it could work, but it's kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what's going to stick. It's going to work for some people. It's not going to maybe work for others because everybody is at a different place in their lives and their stages of development. And even if you have very specific leadership development programs for high potentials, emerging leaders, etc., it's still a little bit more of a one size fits all type approach. And so what I find works best and what I'm seeing right now is kind of leading the charge is a much more personalized approach to leadership development. And so if we first have an introspective journey with our leaders and have them look inward and really understand the impact that they have on others, that's when leadership development can be most effective. And so with that kind of more introspective journey, it lays the foundation for understanding, okay, how is this emotional intelligence course going to apply for me? How is this going to work for me, et cetera? And so then when you can kind of fine tune it based on the gaps of the individuals going through the program, as well as opening and changing their perspective, you're going to hit the target so much more effectively and frequently.
So what I hear you saying there, Erin, is, it's a hot topic. Thankfully, people recognize the importance of leaders. And so they're going and asking, hey, please spin up trainings. Let's make sure we're supporting our leaders. But in the creation of that, it tends to be, hey, let's just see what's working for others and let's take things off the shelf instead of starting with first, hey, who are our leaders? Where are they starting from? What is it that they need? And how do we start them in the program in a place of their own introspection as leaders of what is working well for them, what is it that they really need, and where are they coming from in their emotional intelligence and their state of mind. Is that accurate?
Exactly. And it all kind of starts with that talent management process as well. If you have leadership development without talent management, you're not going to have the gap analysis and needs assessment that you really need to be effective. I wasn't going to go that technical in this conversation, but since you mentioned that, I'll go ahead and throw that in there. It really starts with, having a full annual process for talent management, not just a performance evaluation, to really identify where those needs are within your leaders and at what level those needs occur.
Yep. Awesome. All right. Switching gears slightly, but still riding that same wave. Greg, you have spent so many years in human capital management, and you now have a push to bring the social capital lens into that human capital lens so that we're empowering the productive connections that are required for the next world of work. That was a lot of words. I think we could use some definitions. Can you define for us human capital versus social capital, and then give us the elevator pitch on why we need to bring social capital into human capital?
Yeah, absolutely, Kirsten. Thank you. And first, let me do a shout out to Erin on 2 things. +1 on everything she said on the importance. I personally say I believe I sort of have an allergy to generic leadership development. So I love the way, and I know we're going to talk more about that, the personalization. And I have to thank you for your work in the nursing space. My daughter, as we've talked about in the past, is a labor and delivery nurse. You are working and supporting such an amazing and important group of healthcare providers and workers who are so in desperate need. So I just want to do a quick shout out and thank you for that important work. Thank you for the opportunity to just maybe take a second and frame this idea of human capital and social capital. And maybe the simplest way that at least I think about it is, and I'm nearly 40-year practitioner in the human capital space. That's what I grew up in. My dad did that work. I mean, a multi-generational in that space. And this is not to suggest that any of that goes away, but I think when we think about human capital management, I actually think about it as the resources available sort of within an individual, their capabilities, their knowledge, skills, experience, energy, and attributes. And all of those things are important, necessary, but I believe not sufficient. And so my colleagues and I, and we'll talk more about that, have really evangelists in adding the social capital. And the way I would frame that is the resources available within our relationships. We think about those in three specific areas: how they help us innovate, execute, and thrive at work. And there are these resources when we sort of open the aperture to add the social capital to the human capital. There are resources to help us with decision making, to get feedback, to be mentors, to be sponsors, to help us think about our well-being at work. And very often, at least for, again, the 40 years that I've been practicing human capital management, we've been so focused on that, primarily that. What we now know is perhaps up to 50% of our contribution, of our ability to make a contribution, comes from our connections. I'll give you a very brief example, and then I want to, again, learn more from Erin. At the beginning of 2024, if we went back to a time machine and said, what would we know the artist Post Malone as? And everyone at the beginning of 2024 would have said as a rapper. If we fast forwarded that time machine to the end of 2024, people might actually not know what the answer to that is anymore, because he topped the country music charts all summer, last summer. And I would suggest that his human capital didn't change, Kirsten. He still had the same voice, the same capabilities, but what he so thoughtfully did was he activated his connections. He activated his social capital to actually, in this case, the resource that helped him was legitimacy. He created legitimacy by partnering with other country artists, by using the teams that did that work, by actually spending a ton of time in Nashville. And I would suggest that the secret to his transformational success from being rap music to country music was knowing Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton is a central connector, a central figure, an energizer who brought him legitimacy, and leveraging his relationship with Dolly Parton gave him legitimacy and helped give him those resources. So maybe a funny example to use, but that's the idea of I've got this talent, this capability to sing, to write music, to play music, but I also unlock what I know through who I know. And in this case, to top the country charts in a matter of months, we all need, I think we should be thinking about who's the Dolly Parton in our life to unlock what we know through who we know.
I was just going to say, we could keep playing out that story and talk about how Dolly Parton is really the leader, that is the poster child of a great leadership development program for social capital. So David actually submitted a question, which is a great one. He talks about, yes, the environment in which we operate and how it is about the interaction between people is critical. How does this affect leadership development? And how often does leadership development evolve into a conversation about fit, he asks. So let's start with the first question. How does social capital lens affect leadership development programs?
Yeah, and so I hope we'll get a chance to double click into that. My experience over the last decade and more, since really seeing the light of adding social capital to the heritage human capital, again, we believe that it's necessary but not sufficient. And so we're going to talk about some examples, and I'll give you one specific example in a moment of how my experience at Workday of intentionally adding connections, thinking about cohorts, was very part of that. But I'll back for a second to the evolution and come to that in a quick moment if I could. I really think that leadership development has had sort of 3 generations of evolution. The first was pure capabilities. What are the, as Erin talked about, what are the generic leadership capabilities that everyone has that we all see? And that was fine and wonderful and all good. I believe then in 2007, Dave Ulrich and Norm Smallwood introduced the idea of leadership brand, which I would capture as sort of the collective. We should have, to Erin's opening point, we should be aligning whatever those leadership capabilities are to the value proposition of our company, to our values, to what's important there. And I believe we're about to enter the third generation of a leadership evolution, which is this idea of connections. So super specifically and practically, and I'm happy to geek out on it later if helpful, but at Workday, we knew that people who are moving from director to VP, what that pivot point on that was going from sort of that hourglass. If we used to think about careers as an hourglass, we would get to that functional apex and expertise. But then the shift to director, and I'd love Erin to challenge me, tell me I'm wrong, or build on that, is then shifting to actually having an enterprise mindset. And so specifically at Workday, when we introduced the program between director and VP, we intentionally included an understanding of your connections. And we measured for every leader in that program 3 things. We referred to as how odd is your network. What's the openness? What's the diversity? And what's the depth of your relationships? And we helped the leaders actually understand how odd their relationships were and how they could improve the oddity of them, if you will, because that's what was required to move into an enterprise leader at that VP space. And we were able to look at that. And especially interesting, at least for me, was during the pandemic, where we saw the openness dramatically close down and had to rebuild that specifically because it's the openness that our strategy gets executed through, that we see and can connect the dots for our employees. So that would be, I know we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I think intentionally adding connections in maybe very specific ways. What does your network look like should be a big add in this third generation of leadership development.
Greg, I think that's such a good point. And you're talking about a tactical thing that was done is the content of the program involved talking about relationships and having reflection on relationships and an analysis of relationships. I'm curious this is to Erin or Greg. I'm going a little off script here. I love, Greg, how you're talking about the network within the organization. What about the relationships with the team itself, the team that the leader is directly responsible for? Have you seen helpful tactics for getting the programming to actually be more about understanding the unique team and those relationships?
Erin, I'll let you start on if you've had thoughts on that.
I do have thoughts, and not to go into a sales pitch for Cloverleaf, but that's how I utilize Cloverleaf. So it's a perfect time to talk about that when I'm developing leadership development programs and the team conversation comes up, because it's all about the leader, but then you also have to really apply and integrate the concepts and theories at the same time. If you don't do that, your program is going to be a Band-Aid. It's not going to be applicable in real time. And so one of the ways that I make sure that we integrate and have actionable takeaways through the kind of conversation around the team and the team development portion is by getting that leader's team on Cloverleaf and doing a team coaching session and talking about, okay, where are the dynamics here? Where have you seen conflict? Where have you not? Why might that have occurred? And so with that kind of understanding of the diversity of thought and behavior on the team, we're able to really more deeply apply and make actionable and tangible outcomes out of the leadership development program.
So for those who aren't on Cloverleaf, I'll say in non-Cloverleaf terms, what Erin is talking about is just take the assessments that people take, DISC, Enneagram, 16 types, and putting that on a team dashboard and being able to really dig into those team dynamics where the assessment isn't only for the leader to help with their emotional intelligence. It's actually getting the data of their entire team so that the leader is equipped, which you can do without Cloverleaf. These assessments are available broadly. But yes, Erin, that is a really good point. And I've seen a lot how a difference in what you're saying is there can be investment into the leader alone and data for them, but how do they get understanding of the unique individuals on their team as well?
Yeah, you need both for sure. Thanks for grounding me and reminding me that not everybody's on Cloverleaf that's on this webinar. So I appreciate it. Yeah, Cloverleaf uses multiple assessments. Not yet.
Not yet on Cloverleaf.
So yeah, I use multiple assessments to really understand the motivations, communication styles, behavioral tendencies, et cetera, of all team members. And we just have an open discussion about it.
Yep. That's great.
Erin, the one thing I would build on that from a research perspective, and whether it's Gartner did a tremendous amount of really good research on this, we've seen it in some of the research that we've done at Connected Commons, is the role that the people leader can play in facilitating those connections to others, being that broker. I do think it is really important. We had done some research back in the day, specifically on a new joiner to a team. And we would have, our initial instinct was it was really important to have the relationship with the people leader. What we found, though, was that people who were more successful, felt better connected, felt more successful, actually had the relationships that Erin just talked about with their peers in their first year. It's important that you can't have a bad relationship or an unproductive relationship with your people leader. But we found that the people leader relationship kicked in year 2 of a new joiner. What was critical, and the things that Erin just talked about, was a wonderful facilitator of the people leader taking responsibility, trading their own social capital to connect a new joiner with other team members in the organization who don't yet have that social capital to do that. So I think that's sort of maybe an interesting twist on the research is people leaders playing the role exactly as let me connect you with Sally, let me connect you with Jehan on this. And then in year 2, deepening the relationship with the people leader, at least in the research we did, ended up to be sort of the order that came in.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Operationally validate that. Yeah.
Yes. So we've talked about a couple of tactical things here. Erin talked about, needs analysis is critical, understanding the emotional intelligence of your leaders, starting out the program in their own reflection. Greg's talking about networks and changing content to include thinking about your odd relationships, thinking about your networks. And also, Greg, what you just said there is training your people leaders to also think about the networks of their people. Let's step back. We are here to talk about scaling leadership development to be impactful to every manager and leader. So I'd love to hear from each of you. Erin, I'll start with you. What do you see as the ideal state of scalable leadership development? Because scaling and quality seem like, how do you possibly do that? So what do you see as the ideal future state, Erin?
Yeah, it's really hard, especially since I just talked about, we have to do these assessments for team development within a leadership development program, and all of that can feel very difficult to scale. But what I've found is automation, right? Anything that you can automate, and I'm not saying standardize and never look at again. I'm saying automate anything you can. The emails that get sent out welcoming people to it, application process, determination process, onboarding them to the leadership development program itself, anything that you can automate. And the reason for that is because then there's not as much tactical work in the program itself, in the development programs. And us, the people behind the scenes or within the program, can be doing things like tweaking it, gathering data, sending out surveys, looking at the ROI, and figuring out, okay, where do we need to adjust things? Do we need to innovate here? Do we need to come up with an alternate solution for this population here? And so we can be doing the things behind the scenes to more personalize the approach for leadership development when we're able to automate the majority of the tactical components of a development program.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do a huge +1 on that. That is absolutely, we're at this unique, once in a lifetime, at least our lifetimes, with new technology, the autonomous coaching, the autonomous capability. I would place all my chips, if I had them all in, on the opportunity for AI and autonomous coaching. This is what will enable what my colleagues and I talk about, this idea of social agility, the ability to look at everyone's unique context, as we talked about, and then helping them think about what are those connections, what are those capabilities they should deploy, and it will be unique for each person. If we're not using technology thoughtfully, responsibly, obviously all of those, but that, the way the world is going, couldn't agree with Erin more. If you're not putting at least half of your chips, if not, again, I would say all of your chips in on autonomous coaching, that's gonna, I really think it's gonna be the differentiator. And I've seen a lot, for nearly 40-year career in this space.
Yeah.
Can I bounce back off of that?
Absolutely.
Well, I completely agree with you, Greg, on the autonomous coaching. And what I think is important to recognize here as well, especially for those of us that are, I will say, millennial, Gen X generation and above, is that everything right now for the younger generations, so for Gen Z and Gen Alpha that's up and coming, there's an algorithm to it. Everything they consume, there's an algorithm, and their personality is embodied within that algorithm. And so everything's personalized. You log on to Netflix, my top 10 are different than your top 10. You go on to TikTok, the stream is entirely different. And everybody could be in really different rabbit holes. So when you think about these younger generations growing up in that environment where everything is so incredibly personalized to them, that's the expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only are us older generations now in the workplace, do we thrive in a more personalized environment? It's beneficial for us, but the expectation as we get younger and younger people into the workplace with these Gen Zs and Gen Alphas is that the standard will be personalization. And so that automation, the automated coaching that's personalized to them, it's a necessity almost as we look to the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I hear is automate everything you can so that you can focus on how you personalize. And also, while you are automating, technology today lets the automation actually be highly personalized and even more impactful so that you can impact every single leader and not just, reserve for the top tier leaders. Yeah, excellent. Okay, so let's be real though. If we're gonna add things, we need to remove things. We all have limited resources. So, Erin, what do you observe needs to be subtracted, needs to be let go of in organizational structures and constraints that talent and learning leaders are currently working within?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Like, what do people need to let go of and stop focusing on? And I already mentioned some of it, that kind of off the shelf type of training. Everything just needs to be much more personalized now. That's difficult though. What's also difficult, and what I find is one of the biggest failures working across industries in leadership development is jumping directly to leadership development.
Mm.
And not taking a look at the population first and foremost and the needs. And so I could come in when I was consulting, I would get people that called me in and said, hey, I want, training on this or a development program for this. And my question would be why, right? Tell me more. What is it? What's the purpose behind it? Because if I'm going to put my name on it and I recognize that this is just a Band-Aid approach and you're doing it to check the box to say that you have leadership development, it will fail. And with my name on it, my name will go down with it. And so I probably 99.9% of the time, anytime I worked with a company developing their leadership development program, I did not go with what they initially told me that they wanted. Instead, we looked deeper, looked to the root cause, and identified, okay, we need to set some expectations and standardize some performance expectations first before we get to the kind of the self-actualization part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Your people need security first. If you recall Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those that recognize that when I say that, otherwise Google it, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there's a pyramid. You need security first, you need safety, you need those personal connections, and then we can get to self-actualization. So the biggest mistake I see is people jumping to self-actualization to check the box. We have to make sure everything else is in place first.
All right, Erin, we actually have two questions that have come in when you've been talking about this needs assessment, from earlier when you were talking about it with EQ to now, and I'm going to combine them for you. So Kelly Blackman asked, 100% agree with EQ and leadership. Some organizations skip it because it feels overwhelming, especially smaller companies. Any ideas about how smaller organizations with lower budgets can scale the work? And then Andrew asked, what are the best strategies for identifying needs for teams or organizations? So I think combine those of how do you really do that assessment, especially with a smaller budget? Because even if you're in a larger organization, I'm sure your budget still feels way too small for what you are tasked with.
Absolutely. And so those are really good questions. Smaller companies, the big thing on the execution side of it is going to go toward the automation and maybe more of a hybrid approach, maybe even asynchronous learning while you're starting off. Just leverage the asynchronous opportunities with technology, because then you can focus on the assessment and continue to gather data. Because once you get the program started, you should be collecting data through surveys, and you're going to be able to know how to make those adjustments and where the needs are. And so if you start, I want to say, just don't hyperanalyze at the start, right? Just jump right in, do it, because you're going to get the data on the back end to know how to adjust it. And that's probably what's going to need to happen in those small to medium-sized businesses where we don't have the resources to just identify all the needs of everybody up front. Instead, just execute and you'll get the market research right there within the program. And kind of going back to Andrew's question, then what are the strategies for identifying the needs for teams or organizations? This is, I mean, there's through that, gathering the data and everything else through a proper talent management system. And then third is looking at a team. If I'm looking at it more micro team level, looking at Cloverleaf as well as a team performance index to gather that information. I mean, when I look at Cloverleaf and I look at that roles comparison, we can see the gaps on the team, and we're going to know why we can never get a project over the finish line, for example. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe we can drop a link to the overview of that portion. It's a great tool within the platform itself that identifies where gaps are in teams.
Awesome. Erin, what is, let's say an organization doesn't do what you just recommended with the needs analysis and with, you know, the analysis of like how it's performing. What is the real cost to an organization if they don't let go of some of the things they need to let go of?
Depends on how much it costs to turn over people in your company. And so right now, you know, kind of the average, let's call it leader. I mean, I want to say the average leader, and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, on this is $25,000 to $80,000 for a single leader when they turn over. And so what you're going to have happen is you're going to lose engagement. And with that drop in engagement, if people don't understand the employee value proposition, if people don't understand where development is going to come from and how they're going to continue to move up in the organization or gather the skills and abilities that they need to succeed in their role, they will turn over. Mm-hmm. And it may be because of burnout or it may be because of dissatisfaction. And so it's going to be that cost of turnover.
That makes me think of something I commonly hear when I talk to talent leaders, which is we're expanding our leadership development program. And I'll say, oh, interesting. Tell me why. And they'll say, well, because we still are not seeing in our employee engagement scores, we still are seeing that leaders are not giving enough coaching and feedback to their people. And I say, oh, what's the cost of that? What's the challenge with that? And they say, because then people don't understand all these other structures that talent has set up. They don't understand their internal mobility. They don't understand their career path. They don't understand how they can get from this level of competency to that level of competency. And if our leaders aren't using all of those things and then coaching their people, we lose our people. Like, so you talked about losing your leader, but they talk about we'll lose all the people that report up to them because they won't see what you just said. They won't see how they have the support and the tools and the pathway to growing their career inside the organization.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that strain on middle management is where you're going to see it the greatest because they're trying to protect below, but getting the pressure from above.
And that is why we are here right now, because it is hard to think about how you can actually get the support to that squeeze of the middle manager when I hear so many people talking about they can only afford to invest in leadership development at those highest levels. So, Greg.
Yeah, if I could build on that, because I think Erin is 100% right there. I maybe just double click on two things. I do think that it makes a ton of sense to think about the other sort of human capital or HR metrics such as retention and you know, our data would suggest that it takes as long as 3 years to replicate the network of a high performer. So to Erin's point, there is an actual cost to bring a new leader on. Our research, we did a lot of work on this, would suggest that it takes 3 years to build the relationships that are required for a high performer. So that cost is not just the immediate, what is the actual or physical cost to bring that person on. There is a really long tail. In addition to that, there's the disruption to the network of all of those other people. Right. So when we add the social capital lens on, I used to go to Erin to get this work done. She's gone. Who do I go to? I now need to build a new relationship with Kirsten, with Sally, with someone else. The unseen cost of the disruption to the network is extraordinary. And this is where I'd go with that last point, is I would connect it very much to the realization of the business strategy, of the business goals. I think sometimes it's a little bit, it is easier to capture things like retention and those things. But I would encourage people to say, is Sally what's her level of contribution relative to the goals she can bring to the organization. And if she's operating only at 80% or another 10%, not just about Sally, it's the realization of what our bottom line is to the organization, whether that's profit, whether that's return on investment, whether that's return on assets. I would encourage us to try to really connect it, especially with leaders, to say, what if our leaders were 5% more effective? What would that look like on our bottom line? Not just on HR metrics, but on actual business metrics, and calculate that relative to the organization's metrics themselves, and try to hold ourselves accountable to say, well, let's get 5% more effectiveness in this leadership capability. The dollars end up to be huge because they're based on the business. And I have never met a business leader that says, no, I'm okay with not getting 5% more on our bottom line business metrics, whatever those are: customer sat, return on assets, return on investment.
Yeah, well, Greg, just imagine our listeners today are going to take that to their CFO and they're going to say, hey, imagine 5% more efficiency. And the CFO is going to say, give me the math equation, Greg. Like,
I
where
would
do you,
turn to the CFO. There's no one who cares more about that than the CFO, and say, let's work together. What would matter? What would be the bar that we would want to raise on our business? Partner with that person. In the vast majority, Kirsten, as you know, in the vast majority of organizations, the biggest cost to an organization is salary, is workforce, is
Absolutely.
compensation. So I think in every organization I've worked with, my primary relationship outside of the HR business partner was the CFO.
Mhm.
Because the CFO can help me understand what moves the meter on our business. We should be aligned. We're working together. We're optimizing the biggest investment. I see myself as the tactical representative to leverage the biggest cost on the business. And I can take you through every CFO I've worked with, and why in all cases it's always been a she. She has been my favorite person, and the person I learned from, and the person. So I would embrace that challenge, Kirsten, to your point. Go to the CFO, partner with them, say, what meter, where would I move the meter that would matter to our business, and let's go do that together.
Greg, that's amazing what you just said, because I hear all the time from talent and learning leaders, specifically HR generally, but specifically talent and learning leaders. They're saying, I want a seat at the table. I want to be seen as a strategic partner. And my, the people who hold more authority over budget, which is, the great representation of that is the CFO, but it's not just the CFO. The people who hold more authority in budget, I have trouble convincing them. And you just said, you don't wait for them to tell you what they want. You go to them and you say, hey, tell me the metric you are trying to move, and I will show you how I can impact that. I will build my work around your priority. And that's how you got that strategic seat at the table.
Right, because that at the end of the day, that is the person who sets that, right? This is what we want, and then I want to learn from them. I want to go to school with them. I think, to your point, and then we bring out our toolbox and say, to what degree will employee experience move this? To what degree will leadership effectiveness? Will people matter? Then you can take a step back and say, now let me look in my box of tools and say, as an example, I think I can meet that by improving our connectivity by 10%, right? I can improve that. That's the challenge, but figure out what the metric is that matters to the business, and then go to school and say, hey, this is what an exciting opportunity to solve. Which one of the levers that I have control over pulling is going to move that meter the most? And then let's go measure it together. CFOs. So I know I'm making it sound easier than it might be, but I think we make a mistake if we don't think in that collaborative opportunity. The CFO knows what metrics theoretically, that they're going to say, I think customer satisfaction is going to move the meter in this way. Growth in this business environment, better performance in France is going to have this much margin for us. Like, go to them and go to school and say, and then we take that as the challenge to go solve and then solve it together. Imagine having the CFO and you on the same table saying, this is what we move together. Kirsten, Aaron, Sally, you're a hero.
That was bonus points. That one was off script. I'm going to bring us back to the script and ask you, Greg, a similar question to what I asked Aaron of what really needs to be, getting back to leadership development, what needs to be removed from organizations so that, or from talent development or from leadership development programs, specifically, Greg, to add back in the social capital lens. So we have decades and decades and decades of content and wisdom and frameworks built around leadership development. What really needs to change or be removed to make way for social capital?
All right, so I'm going to be super provocative, and if my screen now dies and I like get thrown offline, technical difficulties will know that we tossed me. I really think I would hope we would all look in the mirror and say, what if we spent less time as content creators and more times as curators of what people knew? I think I did this for many, many years and probably still do it, associate and identify with being the content creator. And back to Aaron's, again, somewhat provocative here, imagine if leadership development looked a lot more like TikTok than it does about what we're doing today. You have atom-sized molecules of content, perhaps being created by other people, not you, but you served as the curator, building the algorithms, ensuring the quality, absolutely ensuring that the direction was where you and your CFO and your business leaders want to go. But I wonder is shifting from seeing ourselves as content creators to curators and then letting go what that curation mean. Maybe it means they're autonomous agents doing it. Maybe it means there's technology happening. Maybe it means that we crowdsource amongst our organization and ask our most successful people leaders to be the content creators themselves. I think that could unlock a lot and build the agility that we'll need moving forward.
Greg, I can't help after that but plug a company that I'm a big fan of. It's called Spoken. I just chatted the link to it, but it literally lets you bring TikTok into your workplace. It's creating videos by employees for employees. So they're used a lot in internal communications. They're also used a lot in training and development because who knows better how to do your job than your peer who's been doing it for all those years. And yes, it would be a great plug for leadership development. Let your best leaders create their own content of what has been effective for them and tell their own stories, because people learn the best from stories. Tell their own stories in these videos that you can then take and you can use them elsewhere. So they just got a free advertisement.
And I'm not suggesting you get out of the middle. You have to curate it like a museum curator brings beautiful art together and makes it happen together. That is absolutely going to enable what you and your CFO want to get done.
You got to stay the DJ of the music, but other people can create the music. You just, spin the discs. Yeah, I like that. That's a good analogy. Back to Post Malone. Okay, I'm going to ask you both one more question. It's to both of you, and then we're going to go to our Q&A. So we've got 3 open questions right now in the Q&A. If anybody else has some, please do submit that. So my last question to both of you is, we've talked a lot about some high-level things, actually some tactical things as well. If you just had to summarize or add to tactical next steps, what tactical next steps can our listeners take today to start moving towards more impactful, scalable leadership development for every single people leader inside their organization? Aaron, let's start with you.
Okay. I'm going to refer back to Simon Sinek for this one. So often we get caught up in the how. I say your tangible takeaway should be to go find the why again. Is the why still applicable? Why are we doing this program? What is the purpose behind it? Which strategy of the organization does it apply to? Is it in alignment in the long run? Because everything shifts, but training for some reason just keeps going. And sometimes we forget to adjust it back. So go find the why. That would be my call out to you as homework for today. What's the why behind it, and are we doing it successfully?
Great.
And I'll encourage and invite folks to add a connections element to their leadership development programs. Be very intentional, and it should be an intentional connection. It's not random connections. Find opportunities where if the head of sales and the head of services or product should get together to create more value in that value chain. And there's a fascinating protocol called the Fast Friends Protocol. It was originally written in the New York Times, two professors at Stony Brook College. The New York Times article originally ran it as how to improve the likelihood that your marriage will be successful. But there are 30 questions there that I have incorporated in leadership development programs and then taken time and actually connect people who should be connected, architect connections that matter to your organization, and then have people run that Fast Friends protocol together. And you can dramatically accelerate the openness, the diversity, and at least the depth of a relationship. It's easy to do. The energy is enormous, and people, ironically, and it's hard because you, as the leadership development expert, get out of the middle. You say, it's not about me. I'm going to curate 2 relationships here, and then I'm going to let the magic happen. The Fast Friends Protocol, Stony Brook College, take a half an hour in a leadership development program and have people connect. You'll be blown away by the impact it can have.
That's a great one. I'm writing that one down. Fast Friends Protocol. All right, I'm going to open it up to our Q&A now. I'll start with a question from Tamara Driggers. She said that we are on our enterprise mindset journey. We've found conceptually leaders are all in and using the language or buzzwords to help build their connections. However, we see a gap in knowing versus doing. Can I get an amen? Okay. We see a gap between knowing versus doing, leaders still solving problems and innovating within their functions, and they get caught in their old patterns of behavior. Do you have any pro tips to embed the behavior shift in leaders working to build that muscle?
Erin, I'll let you start if you got thoughts.
I was going to say you start because it talks about connections. So I'm good. I've got an answer. Do you have an answer? You want to?
Please go ahead.
On it. Well, for me, it's kind of equivalent to building a culture. You almost have to disrupt the entire team culture and build it back into the team systems and processes as well. And so I would encourage you to sit down, or encourage, I guess, in your case, you sit down with the leaders and encourage them to sit down with their teams and take a look at their team culture, maybe even redefine it. There are great team culture building exercises out there, and redefine it with that enterprise mindset in mind. So what does this look like now that we're incorporating these words and we want to emphasize, this thing or this action? And it's going to come from disrupting that whole system. Otherwise, people are just going to get stuck in the old habits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll build on that. And Tamara's a good friend, and she and I have worked together in the past, so I didn't want to. I know her well, and am her biggest fan. So Erin, I wanted to give you a chance. But just to geek out for a moment on this, and this is a tool, not necessarily a strategy, but there are resources in what's referred to as an organization network analysis, to Tamara's question, where you can actually measure through both passive and active ways how people are connected. And I've had the privilege to do that with organizations in the past. And then to say, here's where we could identify specific connections based on the patterns of connections that actually exist. So we can sort of know that, apply what those connections should look like, and then empower and enable people to make those connections intentionally. But I really believe a big part of our role moving forward will be to be the architect, the organizational architect of where those connections should be in order to achieve our outcomes. Now, that's probably on the geekier side of this idea of social capital, but there are some very specific ways that we can measure that. I know Tamara knows much of that well based on work we had done together, but I do think there's a tremendous opportunity to be an architect of those connections, to see the value, to say, if organization X and organization Y, they shouldn't be operating in silos. Let's actually build the relationships between those two people, so that we can connect those parts of the organization more effectively, more productively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Greg, you also mentioned that when it goes from director to VP, that's when you have to have that more like cross-functional network, the enterprise mindset. I hear you on the network analysis, which I believe that's work you do with Connected Commons today, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you are in need of that, my good friend Greg can do that network analysis with you. And then is there something else tactical that you did in that VP level training that helped people to spark this on their own, to understand the value and to then go and reflect on their networks and act on expanding to those more odd relationships?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and it gets back to what we've been talking about, is literally even doing what we refer to as an egocentric network analysis, where I just identify the people and the relational benefits or the resource relationships that are important to the organization. Letting an individual do that, and then being able to sort of compare that. What's cool about some of the resources that I've had the privilege to work with in the past, what we did at Workday was to actually then compare and use as a metric the openness, the diversity, and then what specific relational benefits people get from other people in the organization. So there is a whole sort of layer of analysis there, Kirsten, that people can be very intentional. And then it was fascinating, as I mentioned earlier, to look pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Our open networks disintegrated. They dissolved during the pandemic. And those are the relationships that allow us to execute the strategy of the company. So being intentional on, again, maybe going back to the CFO, maybe going back to other organizational leaders and say, which relationships do you think are critical for us to have for the success of your function, and how do those exist today? So make it very tactical, make it very specific, and then say, I'm going to help, Sally get together with John over here and deepen that relationship. Be the architect, be the curator of what those relationships might look like.
I'm going to move on to a question from Tom. He says, Greg, love Fast Friends. Most teams work cross-functionally, not just in their team hierarchy. This connections concept seems to go beyond leaders to their team members. Seems like automation is critical to get deeper in the organization. Does that feel valid?
Yes. And so what I would say, I would be, thank you, Tom, for the question and for the little bit of the affirmation there. I appreciate that. I think it's looking at the context of where people are. And so I think, as an example, we did a lot of work, and our work appeared as a cover story in the Harvard Business Review, of specifically new joiners. Looking at people in different career stages, what we know is that they have and need different network patterns, different patterns of connections. So I think taking a step back, looking very contextually around what does the network pattern of a new joiner need to look like? What does the pattern of a salesperson versus an engineer need to look like? Those, as you can imagine, are two very, very different things. Salespeople need open or bridging networks. Typically, engineers need much more bonding networks. And so using some of the network science to take a step back and say, where is this person? And what relationships, what connections would enable them to innovate, to execute, and to thrive, to have the relational benefits, if you will, or the relational resources they need to be successful. And there's simple ways to do that without even doing a network analysis. That to Tom, to your point, but I'd look at the person's context and say what relationships would matter most in the role and to the person based on where they are in their career stage.
All right. I'm going to go to a zinger of a question. David actually submitted an earlier question and then submitted this as a clarification. If we assume different people respond in different ways to different environments, is the importance of selecting the right people whose values and source of meaning is really aligned with their environment underappreciated? So this is what he meant by fit when he asked that earlier. So I guess, yeah, I'll open it as that, but I might have a follow-up question to this question.
I have a thought.
Go
So
for it,
I'll
Erin.
jump right in. Yes, it 1000% is underappreciated. And, that's a hill that I'm going to die on. We absolutely should be understanding people's values and value aligning basically everything that we possibly can to it. And I know that gets difficult. It's a little resource heavy in an organization. So one of the very first things that I do if a team comes to me and they're struggling is I'll look at team culture and values. And I will give an example of one team, and I will try to keep this as anonymous as possible. But one team that I worked with where an individual was struggling with their day-to-day to build connections, and they were in a customer-centric role. So they were struggling to build connections with the customer. We did a team value alignment exercise. I call it value-driven leadership. And this individual identified their values and said, but this is just professional. And I said, no, the intent here is that we do our core values, which should be both professional and personal. And they go, no, I don't want to do that. And so we kind of talked through it and figured out why. And the bottom line is because this person was extremely religious and they were working with a diverse range of customers. And so in order to feel like they could build that relationship and build that connection, they had to kind of compartmentalize their value away in order to provide that diverse service. And so we had a conversation. And I said, the bottom line is if you don't feel connected to your own inner values when executing your job, it's going to be perceived by others. A lot of times subconsciously, and our subconscious brain will just slap unprofessional or whatever we can on it, but it will be perceived. And so what can we do maybe to shift your role so you don't have that same customer-centric focus, so you can embrace your true values? It's absolutely needed because it just makes everything more effective. And now this team they have higher engagement scores. They've retained everybody. And there was a question as to whether they were going to retain everybody. I mean, all of the things were happening. And this small shift adjusted that.
That's a pretty profound example, though. And my take was going to be quite different on this. My take is I hear this all the time at Cloverleaf where people say, maybe this person's just not the right fit. And I have a lot of experience of organizations we've worked with saying, hey, this person's not a good fit, or it seems like these type of people aren't a good fit. And it really just comes down to personality. And I think that's a core thing we have to have in our leadership development programs, is helping people understand there's a difference between personality and values. Your story is very clearly values. But I think a lot of times people might think, hey, it's the wrong fit, when really you as the leader need to learn to adapt your style, because you have such a broad range of people who have so much to bring, and your defaults are different than their defaults. And if you can learn what theirs are and you can flex to it, that is when you can really get the most value out of them. All right, I am going to end this with I could talk so much longer. And you guys have so much that you have brought to this. Where else can people follow you, learn from you, read your work, connect with you? Greg, I'm going to start off with you. Where can people find you after this?
Yeah, thanks. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, being a connections person, if you will. I'm happy to and happy to accept invitations or discussions. The other thing I'll add is my colleague and I, Kristen Cullen-Lester, have just curated 50 of the world's thought leaders on connections at work in a book called The Social Capital Imperative. It's now available on Amazon for pre-order. Shameless plug there. But we brought 50 of the world's thought leaders for both cases, some cases on leadership development and leadership effectiveness, well-being, knowledge management systems. We brought a combination of academic leaders, 25 professors, 25 practitioners, put them into a big mix, and came up with 470 pages on the social capital imperative. So would love to geek out with anyone if you want to engage more on this topic.
Wonderful. I actually was going to chat that link, and it seems that maybe the chat is disabled, so I apologize. We are going to send a link to your book, and I know it's being promoted next week at SIOP as well for anyone who's going there. But yes, this is quite a profound book, and we will be sure to send the link to everyone. Erin, what about you? Where can people follow you, find you, learn from you, connect with you?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So go ahead, connect with me on LinkedIn, make those social connections. We can leverage technology to do that. And my last name is spelled like tires, M-I-R-E-S. It's weird. But I should pop right up when you just do a quick search for me on LinkedIn.
Erin Myers, Greg Pryor, thank you both so very much for your time today. And to everyone, we will be sending this out to you as a recording. We will also be sure to send the links to the resources that we discussed today. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with any of us on LinkedIn, as we just said, or you can learn more about Cloverleaf at cloverleaf.me. Thank you very much, and we hope you all have a wonderful end of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Bye.